Okay, welcome. We're going to go ahead and get started. We've got a few people still joining us, but my name is Shelley Sailing-Zard. I'm Vice President General Counsel at Lincoln Electric System, and we'd like to welcome you all to the second of our public meetings on the LES decarbonization goal discussion. We've got a few things. We're going to have a brief presentation by Jason Fordick and Scott Benson. And there's going to be some interactive discussion as part of that. And then at the end, we will do the question and answer session, and I will come back on and facilitate that. When we get to that part, I would note right now, we've got roughly about 10 participants. And I know we've got 3 board members right now. Sarah Peets, Lucas Sabalka, and Karen Griffin are on, and we'll probably have some other people join. I know people have a lot going on, but for right now, I'm going to turn it over to Jason and Scott.
Okay, thanks, Shelley, and thank you for everybody that's taken the time to join us this evening. We hope to share some informational and hopefully useful information about our generating resource mix, and then some of the steps that we went through providing board educational opportunities throughout this process. Share some feedback we got with the board on our decarbonization goal setting process, and then also get some feedback from you as we get towards the end of the presentation. So the first thing we'd like to start off with is sharing just a little bit of background on the LES generating resource portfolio mix. This chart on the left here depicts the resources that we have in our portfolio, and just starting at the top geographically here, this icon at the top represents some hydro resources that we have. We've got contracts in place with a federal agency called WAPA, the Western Area Power Administration, and they market power from a series of dams and reservoirs along the upper Missouri River Basin. And so we're contracted to receive hydro energy from that organization. And then we have either partial ownership or contractual relationships in 3 coal plants, one in Wyoming, one in western Nebraska, and then one in Council Bluffs, Iowa. And then these other symbols sprinkled throughout kind of the central part of Nebraska and down through Kansas and Oklahoma, those represent wind projects that we participate in. If you look at that little offset or inset on the left side of the screen there, that's a zoomed in view of the Lincoln community. And these blue kind of teardrop looking icons, those represent natural gas fired resources that we have in the local LES service area. In the upper right part of that, there's a green kind of a teardrop icon there that represents a landfill gas generating facility that we own and operate. And then the wind turbine symbol there represents the 2 wind turbines that you might see when you drive past North 70th Street along the interstate. And along the west side of the community, we have a recently installed community solar array. And so that represents geographically and also the different types of resources that we have in our mix. We think that mix provides us some good benefits in terms of fuel source diversity. We don't have all of our eggs in one basket, so to speak, in the fuel types that we use. So we're not subject to wild fluctuations in fuel prices, since we have exposure to different fuels to serve our generation needs. There's also geographic diversity in this mix. As you can see, we're spread across multiple states. So if there are some types of weather events or other catastrophic events, hopefully not all of our generation is impacted by those. And then we'll talk a little bit later about the Southwest Power Pool and the regional energy market that we participate in. But by having our resources spread amongst a large geographic area, we also obtain some diversity in the market prices that we're exposed to. And so we think all of those things are benefits that we achieve by having a diverse, both in terms of fuel source and geographic diversity in our mix. If you look at the set of pie charts on the upper right side of this screen, this represents the split of resources by fuel type, by a concept that we call nameplate generation, or the maximum generating capability of those resources. If you look, we've got a split between natural gas resources, coal resources, and renewable resources. And from the time period 2008 to 2019, maybe the most noticeable thing on here is the increase in the renewable portion of that pie chart. We now effectively have our resources split about 1/3 natural gas, 1/3 coal, and then 1/3 renewables. And then it's fairly common in the industry to refer to the amount of renewable energy you produce as a percentage of your retail sales. So if you look at the data in the bottom right section of this screen, you can see that in 2008, the energy production from our renewable resources equated to about 8% of our retail load. But in 2019, through the addition of a variety of renewables, primarily wind, that jumped up to about 46%. So as a percentage of our retail sales, our renewables are producing about 46% on an equivalent basis. This next chart that we wanted to share with you, this is a representation of the carbon intensity, or the CO2 intensity, measured in terms of tons of CO2 per megawatt hour of electricity that we produce. And so you can see from the period of 2010 to 2019, we went from having a CO2 intensity of almost 1 ton per megawatt hour down to a CO2 intensity of right at 0.6 tons per megawatt hour. And so that represents a 38% reduction in the CO2 intensity of our resource mix. And there were a variety of events that occurred along the way to create that reduction. One of those is adding something close to 300 megawatts of wind to our portfolio. We also added that landfill gas generating facility that I mentioned on the earlier slide, added the solar facility that I mentioned on the earlier slide. As I also mentioned, we participate in the SPP integrated marketplace, and that took effect in 2014. And so the way our resources are dispatched changed as a result of that market initiation. So there were some changes in the amount of CO2 we produced due to market activities. And then also in the 2017 timeframe, we terminated our contract for Sheldon Station, which was a coal-fired resource. And so that also had an impact on our CO2 intensity and then the amount of tons of CO2 that we're producing. And so over this time period, 2010 to 2019, the amount of tons of CO2 that our resource portfolio created dropped 42% on an annual basis. So we also wanted to share with you that the LES board in 2011 adopted what we call the sustainability target. And that target is to meet our 5-year projected demand growth with sustainable generation and demand reduction resources. And so this chart here depicts a period of time starting in 2011 up through, like I said, a 5-year out to the future goal. And the line chart on this graph represents the incremental increase in our demand growth. So that's the demand growth that we're trying to achieve meeting with either demand reduction resources or sustainable generation. So then the stacked bar charts, they represent in gray the demand reduction resources. So things like our sustainable energy program or our peak rewards program, or some of the energy efficiency and demand reduction projects that we've participated with interlocal agencies that we've partnered with. And then the green part of these stacked bars, those represent sustainable generation projects that we're participating in. So this would be things like the landfill gas projects, the wind projects, the solar projects. Either one of these categories was enough to either meet or exceed the incremental increase in our demand growth. But when you add up both of those types of resources, sustainable generation or demand reduction, you can see that we well exceeded the expectations for the target that the board set for us. And so now that we've shared some introductory and background information on our resource mix, I'm going to turn it over to Scott, who is going to step us through the multiple educational presentations that we shared with the board, and then go through a little bit more detail on each of those types of educational sessions.
Thanks, Jason. As you can imagine, consideration of a decarbonization goal such as this is a complicated matter. So the board undertook a series of education sessions that lasted over a year to get themselves up to speed on the different facets that would go into it, the different implications it would have. We're going to go through all these at a high level, but you can see the list there. The first thing we did was we brought the board up to speed on the Southwest Power Pool, a general overview of the electricity market we participate in. Then we rolled into a little deeper dive with a hands-on workshop of the Southwest Power Pool market. We're not going to do hands-on today, but we're going to hit the high points for you. Then we brought in an external speaker to talk about an introduction to climate change, because that's obviously a very important part of this conversation. We did a little bit of modeling then in-house of a near zero carbon future, what it would cost to really have zero carbon emissions or near that coming from our resource portfolio. And we looked at current generation trends in the US, different utilities, what they were doing for a goal, what they've done so far and trying to achieve that. We brought in another external speaker then, and we looked at the dual role of public power boards. Our board has to wear a lot of hats, and sometimes that can pull you in different directions. And then finally, you can see in September, we did a review of 3 of the first sessions. And why was that? Well, because those sessions were prior to the pandemic. Put a lot of that information in the rearview mirror, so we wanted to bring the board back up to speed. The good news for you, you only have to sit through the one version, no updates. So the first one was a Southwest Power Pool overview. Now, LES joined the Southwest Power Pool in 2009, but it's been around for a long time. It's a regional transmission organization first established in 1941. And you can see on the right-hand side of your screen, the map that shows you the footprint runs from northern Texas up to the Canadian border, about the width of Nebraska, all the way up. So all of a sudden, we're swimming in a big pond. Now, SPP's got a lot of different jobs and roles that they fill, but you can talk about some of the primary ones. We've got 4 of them here. One is they serve as what's called a consolidated balancing authority. Their job is to balance load and generation every second, every minute, every hour, every day, forever. And they have to perfectly match all the time. And they do that across their entire footprint. Before we joined SPP, it was LES's job to balance load and generation within our own area, just like all the other members. But SPP now does that for everyone. They're also a reliability coordinator. That means they're going to monitor the grid and anticipate problems, and then try to coordinate a regional response to make sure they're addressed and keep the lights on. Obviously, they're a regional transmission organization, so what's that mean? Well, they're a transmission planner. They direct all the transmission within their footprint. That equated to over $10 billion in upgrades and new projects from 2004 to 2018. So that's another big job. And finally, they're a market operator. It's their job to administer and run that electricity market to make sure they're reliably serving the load at the lowest possible cost. Now, next we took the board into that deep dive, the hands-on workshop for how's the market actually work? How's it handle capacity, energy, and just as importantly, reliability? Well, SPP's got quite a few rules, as you can imagine, but there's one that really stands tall when you're talking about capacity in the market. All members of SPP, like LES, are required to bring enough accredited generation to the market to meet their peak load plus a 12% reserve margin. So 112% of your peak load, you have to have that much accredited generation. And the key word there is accredited. If you have a traditional dispatchable resource like coal, nuclear, natural gas, hydro, something that you can control when it goes up and down, well, you can basically accredit the maximum output for it. So if it's a 100 megawatt, say, natural gas unit, you can get accredited capacity on the books with SPP for about 100 megawatts. But if you put in non-traditional resources, non-dispatchable resources like wind and solar, things that you don't control, Mother Nature controls them, well, then you only get to accredit a portion of those. And actually, as more of that same type of resource is added to the SPP footprint, the amount you can accredit goes down over time. So if you talk about wind, because there's a lot of wind in the Southwest Power Pool, from the beginning, you might only be able to accredit 15%, 20%, something like that. So if you put in 100 megawatts of wind, maybe you only get to count 20 megawatts, and that's to start with. It's going to go down over time. And again, that's because of reliability considerations in the footprint. Now, LES, we control all the resources that make up our portfolio. We select those. But the Southwest Power Pool, they dispatch them. They decide when resources are going to start, when they're going to stop, what load level they're going to run at. So what that means in turn is that the Southwest Power Pool actually controls the amount of energy that comes out of each of our resources. Now, as part of the SPP market, they're not just controlling the dispatch for our resources, they're controlling the dispatches for resources across the entire footprint. And it's amazing how those dispatch instructions to bring resources on and off and move them up and down across the entire footprint can impact our resources and our load, and financially, our bottom line. Everything's connected in the market. And then finally, we talked about SPP. They're responsible for balancing load and generation. And that's a difficult job, as you can imagine. It used to be not too long ago, what made it difficult was the load. You could control your generation to the most part, but you couldn't control the load. So the load would go up and down, you'd move your generation up and down to match. Well, now SPP has two variables they have to worry about. One is still the load, but the other is that non-dispatchable generation. The solar, and primarily the big thing in SPP today, is the wind. When those resources go up and down because of Mother Nature, SPP has to move the dispatchable resources around to make sure they can balance out with both those and the load. So that's a job that's getting more difficult for them every day. Then we brought in an external speaker, Stoney Cooper, Nebraska Mesonet Manager, to do kind of a climate change 101, provide an introduction to climate change. And he did a great job of not only talking about the complexity of the science that goes into it, but also what the implications might be for the state of Nebraska. Some of the things that Stoney educated the board and staff on were that climate change is real and it's here now, but it's not too late. He also told us that one of the downsides is that humans are one of the primary causes, the primary cause. But there's a silver lining to that, because if you're the primary cause, that means you can be a big part of the solution. Now, he told us Nebraska can expect to see temperatures that are 2 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit higher in 2050 than they are today. And when you hear that, you think, well, that doesn't sound that bad, only 2 to 5 degrees higher. But you have to look at when those are going to come. And what Stoney told us is by 2050, what you're going to see is the extreme hot days, they're going to be doubled. And the extreme cold days, they're going to be cut in half. So those higher temperatures are going to come on the days when you'd least like to see them. The other thing he told us is that we should expect more precipitation in the spring and the winter and less in the summer when you probably need it most. The other issue is that's going to come in the form of heavy rain events. What's that bring with it? Flooding and all the other implications. Finally, Stoney left us with one simple thing. The sooner we act, the less risky it is. The more we can do now, the more we can do in the near future, the more of this we're going to be able to stave off. Then we rolled into modeling that near zero carbon future. An economic analysis of the impacts of transitioning our resource portfolio from what it is today to one that is near zero in carbon emissions. And we said we're going to do that by 2030. Now, we picked 2030 because we had a lot of folks talking to the board about when would be a good time to set a decarbonization goal and try to achieve it. And they said 2030. And the other thing is 2030, that's not so far out in the future. We can actually kind of see that. We have an idea of the technology that might be at our disposal. Given the best information we have today, LES would have to double our rates in order to make that change by 2030, to be net zero carbon or close to it by 2030. What's that equate to? That's about $4,000 of additional bills the customer would have to pay for a residential customer. That's $4,000 on top of what they would have paid to LES over that period between now and 2030. They also would, for an industrial customer, it equates to an additional $10 million. So not things to be taken lightly. The one thing we told the board, though, is an analysis like this has so many assumptions, so many unknowns that you just can't accurately forecast what those costs are going to be, even for 2030, and certainly if you start to look beyond it. So the important thing to remember is, in the end, establishing a goal like this, that doesn't cost us anything. There are no financial implications to establishing a goal. Where the financial implications come are all the decisions that are going to come down the line, all those forks in the road, where you decide to add different resources, to get rid of certain resources. That's where the money's on the line. And that's where you have to be careful and put in the due diligence, try to make the right decisions at the right time. And honestly, whether you have a goal or not, you're going to face most of those same decisions anyway. That's where the big trouble will come.
So at the July board meeting, we shared some information on what we saw with current trends in generation portfolios across a variety of utilities. We looked at a number of utilities and calculated some data and some trends for them and shared that information with the board. And we also looked at the various types of emission goals that a lot of those utilities were setting. And what we saw was that in general, there were 3 different types of goals that utilities were setting. There were varying percentage of renewable resource goals, reductions in CO2 emissions goals, and then also carbon neutrality, or offsetting as much carbon as you produce with some other mitigating technology. And so what we shared with the board was that even in the absence of us having a CO2 goal, the aggregate rate at which we produce CO2 from our resources dropped by 38%. That same information that we shared with you in an earlier slide. And over that same 2010 to 2019 period, as we shared with you before, our total tons emitted dropped by 42%. When we looked at the other utilities and the amount of renewable generation that they were producing as a percentage of their total generation, we saw that our renewable generation percentage either met or exceeded all the production metrics or all the production percentages produced by those other utilities. And then that same 2010 to 2019 period where we said we reduced our CO2 tons emitted by 42%, well, that exceeded the CO2 reductions from the utilities that have already set some type of net zero or zero CO2 goal. At the August board meeting, a gentleman by the name of Ken Colburn from Symbiotic Strategies spoke to our board. Mr. Colburn has a background in utility regulation, and he also provides technical assistance and public policy assistance to a variety of boards. And what he shared with the board is that many times board members face a variety of competing roles and responsibilities in their role on public power boards. And some of those roles that they have to play are that of a director, a regulator, and then also a consumer advocate. So as a director, the board members take on a fiduciary responsibility to act in the best interests of the organization and try to pursue its mission and its goals in a prudent fashion. But as a regulator, the boards try to act in the role of a regulating body or pursue the public interests and the government's role in implementing regulations. And sometimes those can be in conflict with what they're trying to do for ratepayers. And they want to make sure that the rates that are set for customers are just, reasonable, and not unduly discriminatory. And then he mentioned another competing role, that of a consumer advocate, where board members are trying to look out for the best interests of their customers. And he mentioned that sometimes this can be complicated for the board members, especially if they are in a board where they are elected to their position. They may have made certain promises or set certain expectations with their constituencies, and then they learn that in their role as a director or a regulator, some of those promises might be hard to accomplish and balance against the other roles that they have to play as a director or regulator. And then he went on to point out that the electric utility industry is facing a number of very significant and profound challenges. And in their role, they probably cannot avoid all the risks that they need to make decisions on. For example, in the context of choosing your generating resource portfolio, you might take on a strategy that is a business as usual strategy. But if you do that, there are certain risks that you're going to occur. Or you could take on a strategy with your resources that are going to be a cutting edge type strategy. But there are risks that you're going to take on if you pursue that strategy. So even though the public power board members may be able to choose some of the types of risks that they get exposed to, there's just no way that they can avoid all the risks that are coming in the electric utility industry. And so now that we've shared some educational background material, the type of material that we shared with our board, we want to now use the same material that we shared with the board to frame up the decisions that must be made to set a decarbonization goal. And in that context, we wanted to start out this part of the presentation by sharing with you the goal that was set in the recently announced climate action plan announced by the mayor's office for the city of Lincoln. And the goal that was announced in that plan was for the Lincoln community to achieve an 80% net reduction in greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. So in the context of that goal set for the Lincoln community, and then the information that we shared with you about what other utilities are setting for goals, we framed up the decision for the board in this manner. We think there are really a couple key decisions that you need to make first off. One is, do you plan to choose a renewable percentage goal or a CO2 reduction type goal? If you go down the path of this decision tree on the left side of the screen where you're setting a renewable goal, well, then there are a couple key decisions you want to make. What renewable percentage are you going to try to achieve? Maybe 50% or 80% or 100% renewables, or maybe some other percentage. And then what year do you want to try to achieve that goal? 2030, 2040, 2050, maybe some other year. Now, if on the other hand, you go down the path of a CO2 reduction goal, Well, then you have a similar set of choices you need to make on the percentage. Do you want to reach an 80% reduction in CO2, 90% reduction, 100% reduction, maybe some other percent reduction? And then again, what year do you want to achieve that? 2030, 2040, 2050, maybe some other year. And then another choice that the board would need to make is, do you want that CO2 reduction goal to be a net goal? And we'll dive into this a little bit deeper on a later slide here, but a net goal essentially provides you some other tools in your toolbox where if you are still emitting some CO2 from your generating resource fleet, there might be mitigating technologies that you can do to reduce that CO2 by some other means, extract it from the atmosphere or remove it from the exhaust stream so that the net amount of CO2 that you produce is at the goal that you're trying to achieve. So now if we go into a little bit more detail on a renewable percentage goal, well, this typically takes the form of some percent renewable by some future year. And so some text examples that we saw when we looked at goals that were set by other utilities were what we show here. Maybe something like generating 50% of your electricity from renewable resources by 2040, or maybe generating 100% of your electricity from renewable resources by 2050, or maybe something of the form like 100% of the energy consumed by customers will be renewable by 2050. In terms of our generating fleet, well, depending on the magnitude of the renewable percentage that you set, you're most likely going to see reduced output from our fossil fuel units all the way up to retirement of those fossil fuel units. And then the types of generators that we'd like to have or would expect to have in our portfolio if we go down the path of a renewable goal are the things you probably expect. Technologies like wind, solar, hydro, biofuels. We listed nuclear on here. There's a little bit of debate within the industry whether or not nuclear resources can be counted as renewable resources, but if they can, well then they can certainly help with some of those accredited capacity needs that Scott mentioned in earlier slides. We'd most likely expect that energy storage technologies, things like pumped hydro or battery storage, would be an integral component of a portfolio in a renewable percentage goal. And then technologies that are gaining some traction or gaining some attention are things like hydrogen, where you could use hydrogen as an energy carrier to fuel generators that are producing electricity and not emitting CO2 in that process. And so green hydrogen, the concept of green hydrogen would be that you produce hydrogen from resources that produce zero CO2 or are renewable resources, and then that hydrogen coming from a zero CO2 source can be considered green, and so then it would count in your renewable resource portfolio. And then this last box here, different types of CO2 emitting mitigating technologies. Well, we left that box blank on this particular slide because if you set a percentage renewable goal, the metric that staff would be trying to achieve is that percentage of renewables. We wouldn't strictly be tracking reductions in CO2 emissions. We'd be tracking what percentage of our total renewable or of our total generation is coming from renewables. So we left this particular box on this slide blank. Now, if you go down the path of a percentage CO2 reduction goal, this typically takes the form of some type of or some percentage reduction in CO2 by some future year. So examples of this would be reducing your CO2 emissions 80% by 2050 from 2010 levels, or maybe reducing CO2 emissions 100% by 2050. Another way of saying a zero CO2 goal. Or maybe something of the format like 100% non-carbon resource mix by 2050. As it relates to our generating portfolio, well, depending on the magnitude of the percentage of the CO2 reduction that gets set, you're most likely going to see reduced output from our fossil fuel units all the way up to retirement of those fossil fuel units. But now we pick up some more tools in our toolbox here to meet this goal. With this type of goal, you might see retrofits of existing fossil fuel units with CO2 emissions mitigating technologies. In terms of the resources that we'd like to have available to us, well, it's the same list that we showed on the previous slide: wind, solar, hydro, biofuels, nuclear, energy storage, hydrogen. But we added this column in the middle of other technologies that might be available to us. One of those would be natural gas. If you produce a megawatt hour of electricity from a natural gas resource, on average, it produces about 1/2 the CO2 that producing that same megawatt hour does from a coal resource. So if you replaced your coal resources with natural gas resources, you would right away reduce your CO2 emissions by about 50%. Other things that you might see is a retrofit of existing natural gas resources with CO2 emissions mitigating technologies, or possibly even retrofitting existing coal resources with CO2 emitting mitigation technologies. And then in that category of mitigating technologies, well, now maybe tools are available to us like carbon capture and storage. There's quite a bit of research going on in this field to prove that it can be done at scale in a technically viable fashion, but then also at a financially viable fashion. And then energy efficiency, the theory being that if you can reduce the amount of load that customers place on our system, then you need to produce less electricity to meet that customer energy demand. And if you don't need to produce the electricity, well, then maybe that reduction can come from a fossil fuel resource that you otherwise might have ran, but now you don't have to because you don't need to provide that electricity. So there would be a reduction in your CO2, helping you achieve your CO2 reduction goal. And then the last group of CO2 goals would be a net reduction in CO2, typically taking the form of a net reduction in CO2 by some future year. So some text examples of this: reduce net CO2 emissions 80% by 2050 from 2010 levels. Well, this takes the form of what we shared with you earlier of the city's climate action plan goal. Or maybe net zero CO2 emissions from electric generation by 2050. Or maybe something like 100% carbon neutrality by 2050. In terms of our generation portfolio, well, we have a lot of the same comments here that we had on the previous slide. Depending on the magnitude of the CO2 reduction goal, you could see reduced output all the way up to retirement of our fossil fuel units, and then possibly the retrofit of some of our existing units with CO2 emissions mitigating technologies. And down in that bottom box on this slide, the different CO2 emissions mitigating technologies we have available to us. Well, once again, we listed carbon capture and storage and energy efficiency, but now there might be some more tools available to us. One of those might be tree planting or reforestation, where if we could partner with entities to plant trees and those trees pull CO2 out of the atmosphere and sequester it in the tree, well, that would be a reduction in CO2 that we could use to net against other resources that might still be emitting CO2. Or maybe things like modified agricultural practices, things like cover crops or different fertilization techniques that would help pull CO2 from the atmosphere and sequester it in the soil. Another thing maybe available to us would be electrification or fuel conversion. The theory being that if you can take a function that's currently being done by burning a fossil fuel and instead perform that same function by using electricity as your fuel source, and if that electricity is produced from a resource that produces little or no CO2, well, then there's a net reduction in the CO2 emitted to accomplish that same function. And that might be something that we could use to help net against our CO2 emissions and meet the goal. And then this broad category of other. We try to remain optimistic that there's going to be a lot of technology improvements and other tools available to us. And we want to remain open to all those different technologies so that we can try to achieve this goal in the most cost-effective and technically viable fashion. So now that we stepped you through all that, which like I said was the same presentation and the same format that we shared with the board, we got back to this decision tree. And the next part of this presentation is to go through the polling and the feedback that we got from our board when we posed these questions to him and what their thoughts were on what type of goal we should set and the other parameters of that goal. So with that, I'm going to turn it back to Scott, who will step us through the results of that polling with our board.
Yeah, as Jason mentioned, this polling was just done last month on October 16th at a public board meeting. As we asked them a series of questions, the board members were able to answer anonymously. It was just meant to get a preliminary feel for kind of where they were all setting on different components of this goal, to see if we had some kind of consensus, if we could start to filter down towards some conclusions. So the first question we asked the board is, what type of decarbonization goal do you currently prefer? Hang on a second, my lights turned off. Okay. Look at that, energy efficiency at its finest. So we talked to them about what kind of decarbonization goal do you currently prefer? Well, the first option was to have no new goal, maintain that existing sustainability target we talked about. And as you can see, we had a board member actually vote for that. I'll give you a little bit of context about that one. If you look at it, if we had that sustainability target, offsetting load growth with either sustainable resources or energy efficiency, demand side management. Well, everybody's heard about the rumored data center that might be coming to town. If we had a data center come and added significant load to the LES system, what we would have to do to maintain that sustainability target would take us to many of the same places that a decarbonization goal would take us, certainly in the near to midterm. And we also had a new CO2 reduction goal, and you can see that most of the board members were looking at that. And then finally, a new renewable goal. So we had a little bit of consensus right off the get-go. And we said, okay, if we're going to do a potential CO2 reduction goal, do you currently prefer a net type goal? Remember, that means we do a reduction, and that reduction can either come at our power plants, or we can do a net reduction because we can do other things outside the direct area of the power plants, which removes CO2 from the atmosphere, and that was 100%. All the board members said, we're going to do a CO2 reduction goal, let's make it a net type goal. Gives us more tools in the toolbox, as Jason mentioned. And we said, all right, so what percentage do you currently prefer to target? In this context, based on what they had said, this would be the percentage reduction from a net carbon reduction goal. And as you can see, most of them were on 100%, followed then by 95%. So right away, we had pretty good consensus. And then we asked them, what completion year do you currently prefer to target? The leader there was 2040, followed by 2045 and 2050. Again, pretty good consensus. Now we had told the board it's a little weird to talk about the completion percentage you would like to go after as well as the completion year. Those things kind of work together like yin and yang, but we had to break them apart. As you can see though, we ended up with some pretty good consensus. So a good starting point. Now probably what is going to be the most exciting part of our presentation, we're going to do some attendee polling. We're going to talk to each of you and see what you think on some of these decisions. So we're going to start off with a little bit of demographic information. It allows us to see who's all participating and allows you to get warmed up and get a feel for the process. So the first one, pretty easy. Are you an LES customer? So go ahead, click yes or no. And once everybody gets those submittals in, then we will go ahead and see what our results are. We would imagine that most of you are LES customers, but we've had a few on other sessions who were from outside our service territory. Okay, there we go. 93% are LES customers. 7% sounds more than if you just say one from not an LES customer, but that's okay. Welcome to everybody. All right, these next couple of questions are only for the LES customers. First off, are you a residential customer or a business customer or both? Same thing. Pick the one that applies there. Okay, 100% residential customers. All right. Now again, just for the LES customers, and this one's going to take a little bit of a while, we want to know which of the following LES programs or incentive rates have you participated in. And this one you get to select all that apply. So we've got community solar, our SunShares program, where you can contribute as little $3 per month to support our local community solar project, which was the first utility scale solar project in the state of Nebraska. Or virtual net metering, where you can actually purchase the rights to a panel at that facility. And through the magic of our billing system, we make it look like it resides on the roof of your home or your business. So each month on your bill, you see how much energy you consume from LES, how much energy your panel or panels produce for you virtually, and you only have to pay on the net. Then we have the customer-owned generation side, people that typically put solar at their own residence or business. We can do net metering from 0 to 25 kW, where you have incentive rates to offset the load you consume from LES. And then also we have a renewable generation rate that covers 25 to 100 kW systems in size. These are larger, and you're not offsetting your load, you're just selling all of your production to LES. We have businesses who have done this on their own, and we have neighbors who have gone together and do a form of neighborhood solar where they pool their resources, build a solar facility. Once a month they get a check from LES and they distribute it to all their partners. On the load management side, Jason mentioned it before, the sustainable energy program, those incentives that help you do better lighting, better air conditioning, things like that at your home or your business. Also peak rewards. That's our smart thermostat program where we control people's Wi-Fi enabled thermostats in the summer. We reduce their air conditioning setting early in the day so that later in the day, hopefully their air conditioner is not running when we're at our peak load, when the requirements for power are at its highest. We've had a series of electric vehicle rebates out there for the purchases of new electric vehicles or plug-in hybrid electric vehicles. And then we also have an EV interest group where we share all kinds of information, both in different newsletters and in webinar form to keep people up to date. A lot of people involved in that, as you would expect, have electric vehicles. A lot of people don't, but they're interested in them. They want to be in one someday, so they're trying to learn about it. We also offer renewable energy certificates, where for every megawatt hour of energy produced from wind or solar, the DOE says, the Department of Energy says that makes one renewable energy certificate. It's like a piece of paper that essentially says, hey, I own that wind or solar. I'm 100% renewable because of that power. If you have renewable energy certificates through LES's program, you can reduce your carbon footprint, actually officially say you're 100% renewable, and each month it's automatic. We just add a small fraction to your bill to purchase those certificates. And finally, paperless billing. It allows us to not have to go through the paper, obviously, or put the labor into issuing all those bills. So please go through, select all those that apply. I will tell you, if your screen's like mine, there's a little gray slider bar on the right-hand side. You need to pull that down so you can see the stuff at the bottom of the list. But remember, click every box that applies to you. Like I said, this one takes a little bit longer. You got to click more buttons. Okay, Kyle, our man behind the scenes, says you get a few more seconds. Oh, I spoke too fast. He already took it down. Sorry for that. So let's see. So our leader is SunShares, 55% of the people there. Followed pretty closely by virtual net metering. That's pretty good. We've got a lot of folks with sustainable energy program. Usually at other sessions, that's been #1. Got some people in peak rewards. People in that EV interest group, that's a great one. Like I said, if you're interested, that's free to get involved with, really good information. All right, we've got some people using our renewable energy certificate program. That's fairly new, the way to do that on your bill. And then some people on paperless billing. For all of you, paperless billing is pretty simple to do, so look into that. So thank you very much for that demographic information. All right, so now we go into the meat of the discussion. And this is for everybody, both LES customers and non-customers. So in consideration of a long-term net carbon reduction goal, what percentage of reduction would you prefer for LES to target? 50%, 60%, 70, 80, and then we get a little more granular for you, 85, 95, 100. And if you're not into this kind of goal, then you would say none. And I will tell you, why did we start at 50%? Well, because we're already at 42%, as Jason mentioned. So 50% is about as low as you would go if you're going to set a new goal. So go ahead and pick the one that you would prefer. Everybody must be putting a lot of thought into the question, and that's good. Okay, let's see. We got about half the vote for 100%, and then pretty good distribution after that. Really 95%, 90, 80, and 70%. So 100%, definitely the leader there. Now, same thing, if you're looking at a long-term net carbon reduction goal, what completion year would you like us to target? By what year would you like us to achieve the percentage that you had on the previous question? So you've got 2030, 2035, 2040, 2045, 2050, and again, to suit everybody, we've got a none on there if it doesn't apply to you. And I should probably mention, for those of you who might have been on the session yesterday, this question and the one before it, we didn't have on yesterday's session. We had the idea to add them afterwards to get a little bit more information. So see, if you came back twice, we had a little bit of new information for you. Wasn't just a repeat. So 2040, 62% of you. Next looks like 2050. And then we have a couple for both 2030 and 2035. And finally, the last one. As we mentioned, the LES Administrative Board, they did that polling session similar to this. And they were able to come down to a fairly good consensus and get a couple of ranges. So the goal that they're starting to whittle down towards is a 95 to 100% reduction in net carbon dioxide emissions from our generation portfolio by 2040 to 2045. So given those ranges, which combination do you prefer? And we have all of them for you. A 95% reduction by 2040 or a 95% reduction by 2045. Likewise, a 100% reduction by 2040 or a 100% reduction by 2045. So please tell us, based on that range that the LES board had started to filter down to, what would be your preference there? Okay, so 62% of you are at 100% reduction by 2040. Next was a 95% reduction by 2040. And then it looks like we had a vote for a 95% reduction by 2045. We appreciate the feedback. As we've told other groups, so honestly, there's not a whole lot of difference between 95 and 100% in 2040 and 2045. The board's already filtered down pretty close to a pretty good consensus, but we appreciate that feedback. At this point, I'm going to hand it back over to Shelley, and we're going to now open it up to take your comments.
Okay, so if you can find there in your lower right corner of your toolbar, there should be a little hand that says raise hand. If you would like to speak, you can click that and I will watch the queue and call on people and release you to talk. And for those of you that might have been on yesterday, I had a question earlier today about whether you could speak again. Absolutely. Not everybody on the call would have heard your comments, and we're happy to hear your comments again. So the first one I have is Ken Har.
Okay, well, I'm going to be very brief because Lucas and I are on a panel at 7. Thanks very much for this opportunity. And the one thing I would like to add or suggest that you consider that I'm not sure I've seen on some of the planning is that consumers are going to have to be educated about climate change. Whatever is done to reach these goals will make some changes in the way people pay their bills or what the bills are and all that sort of thing. And LES, just as the city of Lincoln and working towards sustainability, I think just can't lay this on to consumers, but consumers have to be educated. We still expect and we see leadership from the LES board and from the staff, but people need to be educated, and that would be my comment. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Ken. Appreciate that. And I hope you can tell from the presentation tonight, education we thought was pretty important. We've spent a lot of time doing that with our own board. So thank you for that. The next person I have is Penny Greer.
Okay.
Am I unmuted?
Yes.
Okay, thank you, Shelley. I want to thank LES for giving our community an opportunity to address this all-important matter. And I want to publicly thank Jason Fordick for helping me understand even more fully the world that all of you live in. I hope to continue our conversation, and I'm very grateful. I'm Reverend Penny Greer, a 35-year serving retired United Church of Christ pastor who's the president of the board of Nebraska Interfaith Power and Light, an organization committed to education and advocacy within the spiritual and faith context. In 2006, I received an additional bachelor's of science in geology at the University of Indiana. In 2010, I moved back to Lincoln, where I was raised. Since 2010, I've been taking classes in meteorology and climate at UNL, working toward a degree in climate. I am a slow but thorough learner. That's my style. Right now, many climate scientists are trying to evaluate the challenging reality that our climate may actually be moving into an alternative state. Stoney probably knows about this too, but it's not exactly in his wheelhouse. That's much like a lake, which almost overnight switches systems to become clogged with algae, which gradually gets worse with the lake unable to go back to the earlier system, no matter what is tried, resulting in dead fish, non-potable water for humans or animals, and lots of other ecosystem changes. So could the climate do that too? Well, it certainly has in Earth's history big time. 125,000 years ago, 3 million years ago, we're dealing with conditions like the ones we're living in now. And then, of course, 55 million years ago, 100 million years ago, those are major times of hothouse climates. We know that in geology. We might be able to adapt, but how fast would the transition be? We know we're moving in this direction, but there is uncertainty as to how it all might work. But what we do know is how much carbon dioxide has been put into the atmosphere, how long it tends to last, around 1,000 years, and that we cannot keep putting so much CO2 into the atmosphere because it just builds on what's already there by burning coal or even natural gas. We have no choice but to go renewable, no matter what it costs or how hard the transition. I support 100% by 2040. Jason is helping me understand all the considerations that must come into effect, but I hope to help as much as I can in helping LES to educate and interpret that goal within our community. Thank you so much for listening, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you, Penny. Before I go to the next speaker, I think I'll note again that we have about 16 members of the public on the call tonight. And we also have 3 board members on tonight, Lucas Sabalka, apparently for another 5 minutes anyway, Sarah Peets and Karen Griffin. Yesterday on the call, we had about 5 board members that were joining us. And I would remind you, if you haven't noticed up in the corner, we are recording this session, and we recorded the session yesterday, and we'll be making those available for people who weren't able to attend either one. Those will be out on our website, I believe, probably by tomorrow. So you can look for that as well. Moving on again, I'm going to remind everybody that you've got a raise hand button in your lower right-hand corner. And I'm going to apologize if I mispronounce any names, but the next one I have is Jesse Starita. Jesse, are you there?
Hello, Shelley. Yes,
Yep.
I am. Am I unmuted?
Yes, you are. You're good.
Good to go. Thank you so much, Shelley, and thanks to the LES staff, and thank you to the board for making this a great opportunity. And I was tuning in and out to the presentations, but have followed for the last several years your movements in what I think is a very good direction, and the direction that we really have to go. And I'm not going to get into any real details or any of the economic or other arguments. I just want to read a line from a book by Naomi Klein, who put together a series of essays. It's excellent reading for people who are passionate about clean, renewable energy and climate change, called On Fire. And I just want to impart this to the board as my public comment. On page 33, she writes, "It just so happens that we are all alive at the last possible moment when changing course can mean saving lives on a truly unimaginable scale." So I know that's kind of highfalutin and a big thing, but I think that's actually what we're talking about when we're talking about going to 100% renewable energy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jesse. I'm going to ask you to do one thing. If you've got the capability to do that, if you would go in the chat on the Zoom call, and if you would put the name of the book and the author in the chat for us, that'd be great.
Sure, happy to do that. Thank you.
Thank you. Next, I have Laurel Van Ham.
Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Yep.
Okay. As a consumer, I gulped with the slide that said, this is going to cost us, typical person, typical household, $4,000 a year. I'm willing to pay that, and I think a lot of other people are. And for some people, doubling their electric bill will mean a lot. But something that needs to be taken into consideration is that there's a lot of recognition now that we have to put a price on carbon. And that recognition is coming from a theoretical viewpoint of economists, but also even from people in the fossil fuel industry. That's going to happen, and rates are going to go up because of that for companies that are depending on fossil fuels. So I think when we do the education that Ken mentioned, which is very important for people to understand why we need to do this, I think we could talk about the net effect, that a price on carbon is going to mean that power that's generated from fossil fuels is going to cost more, and the power from renewables is not going to have that surcharge on it. And so it won't be that the renewables are doubling the cost.
Are you done, Laurel?
Yes.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Again, there's the raise your hand button in your lower right-hand corner. I have Don Nelson as the next to talk, and I don't have anybody queued up after that. So the queue will be free after Don.
What I have to say now, probably most people on the call will not like it. So I'll state right up front that I am unequivocally 100% in favor of decarbonization for the electric company. but I'm advising the board that I think they're being a little aggressive with both the percentage and the time sequence. I'd like to remind the board that a recent board that I served on was not 100% clairvoyant, and we embarked upon an ambitious program to establish solar and wind as part of our portfolio mix. We did an adequate job, I thought at the time, of collaborating with management to where we thought we understood the vagaries of our relationship with the Southwest Power Pool, which was more recent back then, as well as what's happening in the marketplace. Our decision, when fully implemented, ended up, much to my dismay, for which I continue to apologize, costing the ratepayers $12 million. So I think we ought to take that as an admonition that the board should be very cautious when it goes down this road. Personally, I see no reason to be more aggressive than the city, who owns the utility, has been in establishing their goal. So if you look at their number and their target date, I think it would be great if you adopted that and give yourself a little more flexibility as your relationship with the Southwest Power Pool matures, as you understand the ins and outs of these new technologies and how they're going to evolve. And you can always increase the metrics as you make more progress. I was proud of my service on the board and like going around the country bragging that if you take out those utilities, particularly public power utilities, who had more than 50% of their portfolio in hydropower, because I always felt they had an unfair advantage in scoring their emissions much lower than anyone else, and also having very aggressive rates. But if you exclude those, I think that the Lincoln Electric system is probably one of the top 10 in greenhouse gas emissions progress over the past decade and a half. You've allowed your business plan and the marketplace to determine your course and direction. And the ratepayers have reaped generous rewards for that strategy. I think you ought to stay with that strategy and not depart from it. You still have lots of legacy debt on your books that at this point, none of us have a clue how we manage that as we progress toward reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So take a moment, take a deep breath, slow down. You've made fabulous progress, so it doesn't need to be a sprint to the finish line. It can be a jog, and I think you're still going to be ahead of your peers, both investor-owned utilities as well as publicly owned utilities. Thank you very much for staging these two sessions, and I wish you well in your deliberations.
Thank you, Don. Next, we have Ken Winston.
Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity to participate again. I guess I just wanted to say that I do hope that Don Nelson is proud of his service, because I think the LES board did some really fantastic things while he was a member, and he and Marilyn McNabb and the other members of the board should be very proud of what they did at that time. I wanted to, once again, as I said yesterday, to state my support and the support of Nebraska Interfaith Power and Light and the Nebraska Sierra Club for 100% by 2040. And to also say that part of the reason that I think that's a doable goal is because of the great strides that have been made already by LES in terms of increasing its investments in renewable energy and its reductions in greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that should be a good model for what LES has already done, that LES should be very proud of that, and the community should be very proud of that, and want to state my support for that reason. I also wanted to make a couple of comments about the cost, and because there seems to be some concern about the cost, and that's justifiable. But one of the things that's on Scott's presentation and is that I believe that there's a misunderstanding. It would not be a $4,000 per year increase, but rather $4,000 over 10 years, and that would be that projection was based upon trying to achieve it by 2030, where almost all the projections that we're talking about are 2040, which is 20 years away. And then one of the other things that Scott said in his presentation yesterday, that he said in his presentation, is that the goal itself will not determine the financial decisions that are made by the board. The board will make those decisions as they go along, and I trust that future boards will have the same kind of fiduciary understanding of their obligation to the customers of the Lincoln Electric system to make those decisions. And I guess I also want to say one other thing, well, two other things. One is that there are also investments that have been made in retrofits on fossil fuel projects that have also cost money, and we're not talking about those. And to agree with Laurel that I think it's very likely that there will be some sort of tax put on carbon in the hopefully near future, and that will cause the carbon-based resources, the cost of them, to go up considerably. So once again, thank you for the opportunity to participate in this event, and thank you for all the educational aspects that you're providing for the public, and look forward to more conversations about this process. Good evening.
Thank you, Ken. There is nobody in the queue right now. I'm going to give you an opportunity to hit your raise your hand button, and we'll wait just a few seconds to see if there's anyone else that would like to speak. Linda Brown, you're up.
Unmute. I'm a householder. I also have helped buy solar shares at the Unitarian Church and keep trying to educate the people at the Unitarian Church and throughout the community. And I'm willing to keep doing this because I just think it's critical that we move as fast, Don, as we can to get to as low a carbon as we can get as soon as possible. And as a rate player, I'm willing to pay extra to get there. And I try to convince the people that I talk to that, yes, I mean, LES has given us great service and they've given it to us at our best cost, but there's another factor. And if we really value our climate, then maybe we're willing to pay a little more in order to protect the climate. And that's a message that I'm pretty consistent about. And I say it often to people, and I invite the rest of you to share that message. That's it.
Thank you. Linda. And again, there is nobody waiting. So is there anybody else that would like to make a comment tonight? I'll check here and again in a minute. I'm going to make a few concluding remarks, but I'll check again should somebody raise their hand in the next few moments. Again, we're recording this. Those are going to be available. You can check our website. The other thing I would tell you is the board will be they're scheduled to consider this goal and a resolution at the November 20th meeting. I think yesterday I said November 18th. I stand corrected. Our meetings are on Fridays, so it's November 20th. In between now and then, if there's input you'd like to give the board, you can always email the board at board@les.com. And you can get written comments to them or any other information or statements that you would like to make. Again, I'm looking to see, you can check out les.com/decarb for the replay information. Thank you, Kyle, for that information. And again, I'm not seeing anyone else that wants to speak, but on behalf of Jason and Scott and board, I can tell you that we greatly appreciate the participation we got from the public both yesterday and this evening. I know there's a lot going on and people are busy, so we appreciate that you took the time to join us tonight, and we look forward to further input and dialogue, and look forward to seeing what the board does at the November meeting. Thank you. Have a good evening.